Before diving into women in politics, we wanted to give a brief introduction to gender overall in Africa. So, women in Africa are a vital part of society and contribute enormously to the economies. They're economically active in Africa as farmers, workers, and entrepreneurs, but they still act within the patriarchal societies that exist in African countries. So, these patriarchal barriers prevent them from reaching full potential socially, economically, and politically, which in turn stunts overall development for Africa. We'll be focusing particularly on Botswana, Egypt, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, considering the varying degrees and progress of African countries. On the map, these four countries exist in three varying regions with vastly different geopolitical landscapes and different geographies. They're highlighted in red on the map. Egypt is located in northern Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia lie in western Africa, and Botswana is in southern Africa. It's important to note the gender development indexes of each of these countries before delving into how that translates to political representation for women and gender equality in politics. So for Egypt, notice how after 2014, the GDI in Egypt began to increase. This is most likely due to the new constitution that was adopted in 2014. It included more rights for women and much more room for equality. It's promising, given the state of Egypt's progression in terms of gender equality. These numbers will probably only continue to increase. Botswana's GDI is very high with an average of 0.979 between 2000 and 2018. In fact, it has maintained a gap from sub-Saharan Africa for the entirety of this 18-year duration, as sub-Saharan Africa values fell within the range of 0.85 and 0.89. In 2018, the last known data point, Botswana's GDI was 0.99, indicating it is very, very close to being completely equal. Considering the stability of Botswana since its inception, gender is very likely to enjoy a high GDI and will continue to work towards eliminating existing barriers for women. In Sierra Leone, we see a significant improvement in GDI from 2000 to 2018. It is important to note that Sierra Leone's civil war ended in 2002, which could explain the dramatic improvement we see post-Civil War. On the graph, we see from 2000 to 2010, there's this significant increase in GDI for Sierra Leone compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. It begins to plateau for the rest between 2010 to 2018, but this is still dramatic improvement that we've seen. In 2018, Sierra Leone's GDI is still below the sub-Saharan African average, indicating that there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to gender equality. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Liberia's first woman president, started to pave the way for gender equality, especially during the last few years of her tenure, in which we saw a clear growth in the country's GDI. Nonetheless, the country's GDI is still below the sub-Saharan African average, and the fight for equality has not been developing at the same pace under the government of President George Weah.
So here we see facts regarding women's representation in government. In 2016, 75 out of 558 spots in the House of Representatives were women. These are record high numbers for women in Egypt. Before this, Egypt was among the 10 worst countries for gender equality in the world. Today, women are much more represented than they have ever been, and it is thanks in part to the implementation of the new constitution that was published in 2014. This is all a great step in the right direction, but women still make up 26% of the labor force, which shows there is still work to be done. Representation in Botswana's government paints a stark contrast to its high GDI values described before. In 2019, women only represent 18% of local government seats. This same year, the National Assembly had 11% representation by women. In the cabinet chosen by the president, women composed 25% of the 24 positions. These statistics are far from reaching the target of equal representation in parliament. Despite these numbers, there is a 50-50 principle in place for specially elected seats. In November of 2005, Liberia witnessed an unprecedented and historical change, the appointment of Africa's first elected female president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. This created a clear shift in the way in which gender issues were addressed in the country. Nonetheless, there is still a long way to go in terms of female representation in the Liberian government. According to the UN Women website, in 2015 and 2016, Liberia ranked 40th out of 54 in terms of African representation in government, with only 12% of women in legislature and 6% holding local government positions. Johnson Sirleaf's tenure ended with a positive note in terms of gender equality with the implementation of the new election law, which required for at least 30% representation of each gender in the list of candidates submitted by political parties, and the establishment of new constituencies with quotas for female representation. Nevertheless, the regime of Johnson Sirleaf's successor, George Weah, has been disappointing in regards to female representation in government. Although his vice president is a woman, Joel Howard Thomas, all of Weah's appointees for the cabinet were men, and after both legislative and presidential elections, only 9 women were elected out of 73 legislature seats. This is similar to Sierra Leone, where President Bio also faced backlash when he only appointed 1 woman among 17 new appointments in his latest cabinet reshuffle. Sierra Leone has similar numbers to Liberia and Botswana, with women only holding 12% of seats in parliament. There has been a push for years to enact a law that would require a 30% quota relating to women's participation in politics. Unfortunately, this movement has not been successful. Such a quota could possibly be unpopular with male politicians who believe it will jeopardize their own seats.
Hi everyone, it's Fotini. We now want to move to talk about legislation toward gender equality in Africa. Let's start with Egypt. In 2014, Egypt implemented a new constitution that provided hope for Egyptian women. It also provided hope for various religious groups, but we'll just focus on the parts that related to women. According to UN Women, the Constitution established a 25% quota for women in local councils and thus provided space for at least 13,500 women across Egypt to partake in local development decision-making processes. This new legislation has provided so much more opportunity for women in Egypt and has given them a stronger voice and a greater platform to fight for their rights. It has also provided hope for these women and the opportunity to continue fighting for even more rights in the future. We'll move to talk about Botswana now. The government in Botswana committed to eliminating all forms of discrimination against women by first setting up a national policy on gender and development. This agency will act as a first step to implementing gender equality goals within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Furthermore, the establishment of the National Gender Commission in 2016 was meant to monitor the implementation of policies working to eliminate gender barriers. Now let's talk about Liberia. At the end of President Johnson Sirleaf's tenure on September 29th, the Liberian House of Representatives concurred with the Senate to pass the Equal Representation and Participation Act of 2016, establishing 7 special constituencies, among which 5 seats would be reserved for women, 1 for youth, and 1 for the disabled. The act, in its original version, proposed the creation of 21 special legislative constituencies, out of which 15 seats would be reserved exclusively for women, and 3 seats each for the youth population and people with disabilities, with at least 1 seat allotted for female representatives within each group. Due to budget constraints, the number of 15 seats changed to 7. Nevertheless, the legislature determined a shift in the status quo of Liberian politics. Another important legislative shift came from the implementation of the new election law, which required for at least 30% representation of each gender in the lists of candidates submitted by political parties. Right now, the fight against gender inequality has been put to a halt. President Wei has promised a great deal of things, but has not followed through in the legislation side of them in the promotion of equality values. We'll now talk about Sierra Leone. In 2007, the Sierra Leone government passed 3 laws to try and reduce the gender gap. These laws include 1. The Domestic Violence Act, 2. The Devolution of Estates Act, and 3. The Registration of Customary Marriage and Divorce Act, again, all established in 2007. These laws outlaw domestic violence, entitle women to own property, recognize their right to inheritance, and protect girls from forced marriage. These laws were a step in the right direction when it comes to achieving gender equality in Sierra Leone, but did not fully address ingrained patriarchal practices in social, political, and cultural traditions.
Hi everyone, this is Moises, and I'm gonna be talking about the gender roles and challenges faced by women in these 4 countries. First off, I'm gonna start with Egypt. While there has obviously been effort toward equality, there are still discrepancies between the roles of men and women in Egyptian society. While women finally have the opportunity to serve as more than a domestic pillar in the household, they still have very few places in the workforce that welcome them. Not only are employers reluctant in hiring women in roles of leadership or any authority whatsoever, but Egyptian society as a whole is apprehensive to this foreign concept as well. This shows that there is so much more room for improvement, and there is so much more that can be done aside from the additions to a new constitution. In Botswana, we can see that despite the government's achievement in GDI, gender role changes are necessary to transform political representation. For example, many people in Botswana still see men as the only ones that can occupy positions in power, and this naturally translates to large male dominance in government. These gender roles and assumptions create big challenges with gender representation in government. For example, Botswana uses the first past the post electoral system, which increases this gender gap. Critics have claimed that this system has not brought positive outcomes for the representation of women, youth, and marginalized groups. In Liberia, there has been a constant improvement in the GDI and in female school enrollment in the last decade. There has also been a shift in the discourse. Women are realizing that they are more than half the population and that they are able to create change and impact society. The election of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf established a pattern of girls talking about their capabilities. Activist Lehman Bowie talks about the shift in gender roles. She says, "Take small-scale market women. In the past, they only aspired to maybe go to Ghana and do some cross-border trading. Now, they are taking loans from the bank and going to China and other places to buy their goods." On the other hand, for the challenges, there has definitely been a violent backlash from men as their answer to the changes made towards gender equality and the empowerment of women as a group and as individuals. There are still high rates of sexual assaults and femicides. There is a new wave of competition amongst women, instead of the solidarity that used to be shown in order to achieve equality. Also, the lack of progress and female representation under George Weah's presidency has become a challenge that feminists most face on a day-to-day basis in Liberia. In Sierra Leone, we see patriarchal power dynamics are prominent in the country, as is common among many other countries all over the world. Sorry. Women are deprived of forming their own concrete identities, as their identities are dependent on the relationships with male figures. There are agencies which strive to empower women, such as the USAID, United States Agency for International Development, which helps empower women in Sierra Leone through continuous sensitization, training in leadership skills, advocacy, and planning and entrepreneurship. In Sierra Leone, women face many challenges, such as little representation in government, high illiteracy rates, lack of economic independence, patriarchal customs and violence. Sorry, gender-based violence against women continue to be one of the most prevalent problems in Sierra Leone. President Bayo declared a state of emergency after recorded cases of rape and assault doubled in 2018. The actual number of sexual violence cases are much higher, as many go unreported. Now we're going to talk about the different approaches that can become the potential solutions for the big gaps in gender inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. Listed here we see a shift toward proportional gender representation, further legislative change in the years to come, further UNDP intervention, NGOs that promote women's empowerment, further subsidies for families that will allow women to join the workforce, constant investment in education, sound economic policy making in a fight against poverty traps. So basically, the focus should be in education and in the economy. Allow women to be able to participate in economic development. Now, to end this presentation, we're going to talk about some questions to consider for us to discuss in Thursday's class. How can institutional barriers to gender change when they are intertwined with cultural rigidities? How can sustainable gender equality be achieved? How big of a role does economic development in a country play on its gender equality?